The freezing rain hammered against the cracked windshield of the stolen truck. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white in the dark. My chest heaved with every single jagged, exhausting breath I managed to take. I pressed 2 trembling fingers against the burning curve of my neck. The skin there felt incredibly hot, swollen, and permanently altered. It was a jagged claim stamped directly into my fragile, aging flesh. For over 20 long years, I had perfected the absolute art of being entirely invisible. I was just Grace, a middle-aged widow who baked pies and kept her head down. Society had long ago decided I was far past the age of desire, danger, or consequence. I was incredibly comfortable in my quiet, unremarkable, and lonely grey world. I lived alone, I ate alone, and I fully expected to die alone in my little house. I truly believed my days of making catastrophic mistakes were buried with my lost youth. I thought the wild, untamed parts of my soul had withered away completely. But Marcus shattered that safe, pathetic illusion in a single, violently passionate night. He saw right through my carefully constructed walls at the Royal Winter Gala. I was only there to serve champagne, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting black uniform. Yet, he did not see a tired woman fading quietly into the background of the room. He looked at me like I was the only breathing creature in the entire magnificent hall. He was a man built of shadows, unimaginable wealth, and terrifying primal power. He was the Alpha King, a living myth of brutality, dominance, and dark grace. He did not ask for my name, my exact age, or my permission to approach. He simply cornered me in the dark, secluded labyrinth of the palace hedge maze. His touch woke a dormant fire in my blood that I thought had turned to ash decades ago. I was completely helpless against the overwhelming tide of his dark, predatory obsession. When his sharp teeth finally broke my skin, the initial pain was absolutely blinding. It felt exactly like lightning striking directly into my fragile nervous system. Yet, it was instantly followed by a forbidden, earth-shattering wave of pure pleasure. I had committed the ultimate sin of our hidden, dangerous supernatural world. I had miraculously survived the claiming bite of an ancient apex predator. I was now biologically and magically bound to a ruler who did not understand the word mercy. Cold, rational panic set in long before the morning sun broke over the horizon. I woke up tangled in expensive silk sheets, staring at the beautiful stranger who now owned my soul. I knew exactly what happened to women who caught a royal's obsessive, unwavering eye. They became beautiful, tragic caged birds locked away in silent golden towers. They lost their names, their voices, and their simple, everyday human freedoms. I valued my hard-won, lonely independence far more than a king's dangerous bed. So, I grabbed my worn wool coat, left my shoes behind, and ran straight into the freezing storm. I drove for agonizing hours through the winding mountain roads until the truck's engine finally died. Now, I sat shivering in a dingy, neon-lit roadside diner at the very edge of nowhere. I clutched a chipped mug of bitter, lukewarm coffee just to keep my hands from shaking visibly. My heart hammered a frantic, exhausting rhythm against my bruised ribs. I stared blankly at the flickering television screen mounted above the greasy kitchen counter. The late-night talk show was suddenly and abruptly cut off by a harsh warning tone. A glaring blood-red screen took over the entire national television broadcast. The unmistakable gold royal seal of the Alpha King flashed right in the center of the screen. A news anchor appeared, her face pale and her voice visibly trembling with sheer fear. A national state of emergency has just been officially declared, she announced to the world. All state borders, airports, and train stations are now entirely sealed by direct order of His Majesty. He is hunting a high-value fugitive who vanished from the royal palace before dawn. A blurry security photo suddenly flashed onto the glowing television screen. It was a grainy image of me sprinting desperately through the palace gates in the pouring rain. I stopped breathing completely, my lungs freezing in my chest. My blood ran ice cold in my veins, freezing me right to my very core. He was not just looking for a casual runaway lover to punish. He was mobilizing an entire military force to hunt me down like a wild animal. The massive cash reward flashing at the bottom of the screen was enough to buy a small island. Every tired trucker and grumpy waitress in this tiny diner was now a lethal threat to my survival. Anyone here would gladly turn me in for a fraction of that enormous, life-changing bounty. I slowly lowered my chin, hiding my face deep beneath the shadow of my damp, ruined hood. I needed to slip out the rusted back door before someone recognized my side profile. I desperately needed to scrub the lingering scent of dark pine and heavy musk off my skin. His intoxicating scent was still wrapped around me like an invisible, suffocating iron chain. I slid a crumpled $5 bill onto the sticky, coffee-stained counter. I carefully slid off the vinyl stool, silently praying the old wooden floorboards wouldn't creak. But fate always has a cruel, unavoidable way of punishing those who try to run from destiny. The little brass bell above the diner's front glass door chimed sharply. The loud, rowdy chatter of the midnight patrons died in a single, terrifying second. The air in the cramped room suddenly grew freezing cold and impossibly heavy. A suffocating pressure crushed the remaining breath straight out of my terrified lungs. It was an unmistakable, terrifying aura of pure, unchecked predatory dominance. I did not need to turn around to know exactly who had just walked inside my hiding place. The overpowering scent of dark pine, cold rain, and raw power washed entirely over me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed ominously on the cheap, dirty linoleum floor. Each slow step sounded exactly like a steel nail being driven into my own wooden coffin. Nobody in the entire diner dared to speak, breathe loudly, or even move a single muscle. The footsteps moved slowly past the worn booths and stopped exactly right behind my stool. The sheer heat radiating from his massive body seeped directly through my wet, freezing clothes. A large, incredibly warm hand clamped down firmly onto my trembling right shoulder. His physical grip was gentle, yet it carried an entirely unbreakable promise of utter possession. He slowly leaned down, his warm breath brushing against the sensitive shell of my ear. "Did you really think," Marcus whispered, his deep voice a dark, deadly rumble that shook my bones, "that you could just walk away from me after taking my mark, my sweet Grace?" His deep, intoxicating voice sent a treacherous, familiar shiver straight down my spine. "You are mine now, and a king never, ever lets his queen escape the board." The entire diner was so terrifyingly silent that I could clearly hear the rain hitting the roof. Marcus's large, incredibly warm hand remained firmly planted on my shoulder, anchoring me to the spot. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately praying this was just a cruel, exhausted hallucination. But the scorching heat radiating from his massive body was undeniably, terrifyingly real. I had spent 20 long years blending effortlessly into the faded wallpaper of my lonely life. I was a woman with silver strands in her hair and deep laugh lines around her tired eyes. Kings did not chase aging, ordinary widows through dangerous storms in the dead of night. Yet here he was, an immortal apex predator breathing heavily against the curve of my neck. "Look at me, Grace," he commanded softly, his dark voice vibrating deep within my chest. I slowly turned my head, my terrified gaze finally meeting his blazing, golden wolf eyes. The sheer intensity of his stare stripped away every defense I had spent decades building. He did not look at me with disgust, pity, or the cold indifference I was entirely used to. He looked at me as if I were the only drop of pure water in a vast, dying desert. "You have absolutely no idea what you put me through tonight," he whispered fiercely. His rough thumb gently brushed against the raw, swollen bite mark he had left on my skin. A sudden, treacherous spark of electricity shot straight down to my very toes. "I am not a prize to be claimed," I managed to say, my voice trembling with unshed tears. "I am just a tired, ordinary woman who wants to be left entirely alone in peace." A low, dangerous growl ripped through his chest, making the coffee cups rattle on the counter. "You are far from ordinary, and you will never be alone again," he declared with absolute certainty. The terrified diner owner accidentally dropped a glass, the shattering sound echoing loudly. Marcus did not even blink or pull his obsessive gaze away from my pale, exhausted face. Two massive, heavily armed royal guards suddenly stepped through the diner's front glass doors. They stood at strict attention, blocking any possible route of escape I might have considered. I realized with crushing certainty that my short, desperate flight for freedom was officially over. "Please, Marcus," I pleaded softly, using the forbidden first name I had heard in the dark gardens. "I have lived a whole life before you. I don't belong in your gilded, violent, immortal world." His expression softened slightly, though his physical grip on me remained entirely unyielding. "Your lonely life before me was merely a waiting room for the destiny we now share," he replied. Before I could utter another word of protest, he effortlessly swept me up into his strong arms. I gasped in profound shock, my hands instinctively grabbing the broad, solid expanse of his shoulders. I had not been held like this, so carefully and securely, in over 2 long, heartbreaking decades. A traitorous wave of pure comfort washed over me, actively battling the rational terror in my mind. He carried me out of the dingy diner as if my physical body weighed absolutely nothing at all. The freezing rain stopped hitting me the exact moment I was pressed against his burning chest. A sleek, black-armored royal vehicle was waiting idly on the wet, muddy highway. The heavy back door was quickly pulled open by a guard who deeply bowed his head in our presence. Marcus slid into the luxurious leather backseat, keeping me firmly positioned on his muscular lap. I struggled weakly against his hold, my exhausted, aging muscles finally beginning to fail me. "Let me go, I can sit on my own," I protested, my cheeks burning with sudden, unfamiliar heat. "You ran from me once, Grace," he said, wrapping his strong arms tightly around my waist. "I am never letting you out of my physical reach again for as long as I draw breath." The armored car smoothly accelerated, driving me straight back toward the beautiful nightmare I had fled. I stared out the tinted window at the dark, passing trees, feeling utterly, entirely defeated. My quiet, invisible life was gone forever, replaced by a terrifying, inescapable royal bond. I could smell the rich, intoxicating scent of his arousal and deep relief mingling together. The luxurious interior of the vehicle smelled of expensive leather and dark, ancient magic. I was acutely aware of the rough texture of his tailored suit against my cheap, damp clothes. He traced the delicate line of my jaw, his touch feeling exactly like a branding iron on my skin. I had spent my entire adult life taking care of others, burying my own personal needs in the dirt. My human husband had died young, leaving me to survive in a world that aggressively ignored older women. I had fully accepted my fade into obscurity as a natural, unavoidable part of the aging process. But this terrifying Alpha King looked at my wrinkles and saw only unquestionable, divine perfection. He looked at my scarred, hard-working hands and saw the delicate pores of his fated Luna. "Why me?" I finally whispered into the dark, the sheer vulnerability in my voice startling even myself. "There are thousands of young, flawless women who would gladly die for your attention." Marcus let out a rough, dismissive sound, his golden eyes flashing with sudden, violent irritation. "They are nothing but empty, fragile porcelain dolls looking for borrowed power and cheap glory." He pressed his forehead gently against mine, his intense, heavy gaze locking me entirely in place. "You have a brilliant fire in your soul that somehow survived decades of bitter, crushing loneliness. You are the only woman strong enough to stand beside me and rule this chaotic, bloody world." His impossible words were terrifying, completely stripping away the very foundation of my humble self-worth. I did not want to rule anything, I only wanted the quiet, undisturbed peace of my little garden. But the primal mate bond humming deep in my blood traitorously hummed in agreement with his claim. My treacherous body was betraying my rational mind, leaning into his warmth despite my profound fear. I realized then that fighting the Alpha King's overwhelming political power was entirely impossible. Fighting the magical, biological pull he had over my very soul would be sheer, unrelenting agony. The journey back to the royal capital would be the longest, most dangerous ride of my entire life. I had to find a way to carefully guard my fragile heart before this obsessive king shattered it completely. The heavy armored convoy passed smoothly through the towering, wrought iron gates of the royal estate. I stared out the rain-streaked window at the sprawling, terrifyingly beautiful stone castle looming in the dark. It looked exactly like an ancient, impenetrable fortress designed specifically to keep monsters in and all hope out. Marcus still held me securely on his lap, absolutely refusing to let my bare feet touch the vehicle's floorboard. Every time I tried to shift my weight, his muscular arms tightened around my waist like unbreakable iron bands. He was silently but clearly communicating that my absolute compliance was no longer a request, but a mandatory law. The sleek vehicle finally stopped beneath a massive, brilliantly lit marble portico at the front entrance. Dozens of elite royal guards immediately snapped to attention in the freezing, relentless downpour. They kept their eyes fixed rigidly straight ahead, absolutely terrified to even glance at their Alpha King. Marcus effortlessly carried me out of the warm car and directly into the harsh, glaring lights of the palace. I instinctively buried my face in his broad chest, deeply ashamed of my damp, ruined civilian clothes. I was a 52-year-old human woman wearing a cheap, stained polyester waitress uniform from a discount store. I fundamentally did not belong in this magnificent hall of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and ancient supernatural power. Cruel whispers instantly broke out among the elegant, silk-clad courtiers lining the sweeping grand staircase. They stared in absolute shock and thinly veiled disgust at the incredibly ordinary, aging human woman in their king's arms. I could physically feel their harsh judgment, their biting confusion, and their blatant rejection of my existence. A low, terrifying snarl suddenly ripped from deep inside Marcus's massive, vibrating chest. The horrific, guttural sound echoed violently off the vaulted marble ceiling, instantly shattering the disrespectful whispers. The entire grand hall fell into a dead, suffocating silence in a mere fraction of a second. The next person who looks at my Luna with disrespect will lose their eyes permanently, Marcus stated coldly. His calm, deadly voice sent a visible wave of sheer, primal terror through the gathered supernatural nobility. Proud, ancient werewolves immediately dropped to their knees, bowing their heads to the floor in total submission. I trembled violently against his chest, suddenly realizing the horrific, bloody reality of his absolute political power. He was not just a wealthy, obsessive man, he was a lethal dictator who could end lives with a single, quiet word. He carried me up the sweeping grand staircase, ignoring the kneeling, trembling nobles entirely. We passed through heavy, steel-reinforced doors that sealed shut behind us with a loud, terrifying metallic click. He brought me directly into his private inner sanctum, a massive room decorated in dark mahogany and deep red velvet. It was a beautiful, breathtakingly expensive, and entirely suffocating golden cage designed explicitly for my eternal captivity. He gently set me down on the edge of a massive, impossibly soft, four-poster canopy bed. My cheap, muddy shoes completely ruined the pristine, priceless white silk rugs beneath my trembling feet. I desperately tried to stand up, wanting to put some necessary physical distance between our bodies. But my exhausted, trembling legs finally gave out completely, and I immediately collapsed back onto the soft mattress. Marcus instantly dropped to his knees right in front of me, completely disregarding the crease of his expensive royal suit. He carefully took off my ruined shoes, his large, dangerous hands moving with a shocking, absolute gentleness. "You are completely safe now, my sweet Grace," he murmured smoothly, gently massaging my freezing, aching feet. "Nobody in this entire world will ever be allowed to hurt you, judge you, or look down on you ever again. I looked down at the top of his dark head, my fragile heart breaking under the crushing weight of his impossible obsession. You are the one who is hurting me, Marcus, I whispered, the raw, painful honesty tearing out of my dry throat. You stole my quiet life, you took away my freedom, and you brought me to a dangerous world that actively hates me. He froze completely, his broad, powerful shoulders instantly tensing into rigid, immovable stone beneath his jacket. He slowly lifted his head, his glowing, supernatural golden eyes locking intensely onto my tear-filled gaze. There was absolutely no anger in his beautiful expression, only a dark, desperate, and overwhelming possessiveness. Your old life was slowly killing your beautiful, vibrant soul, Grace, he replied, his voice a low, heavy rumble of absolute certainty. You were utterly alone, completely ignored by a human society that immediately discards women the moment they show a single silver hair. He slowly reached up, his rough, warm fingers gently tracing a faint, delicate wrinkle near the corner of my tired eye. I see every single year you have survived, every bitter tear you have cried, and every heavy burden you have carried. I claimed you tonight because you are the strongest, most resilient creature I have ever encountered in my impossibly long life. I did not bring you here to be my helpless prisoner, I brought you here to be worshipped daily as my undisputed equal. His impossible words were a devastating, emotional weapon aimed directly at my deepest, most hidden personal insecurities. For over 20 long years, I had desperately wanted someone, anyone, to simply look at me and actually see my true worth. Now, the most dangerous, powerful man on earth was kneeling at my feet, offering me the entire world on a silver platter. But my lived experience knew the terrible, undeniable truth about men who offered such absolute, consuming devotion. Their profound love was always a gilded cage, and their fierce protection was just another pretty word for total, inescapable control. Before I could formulate a proper response, a sharp, urgent knock echoed loudly from the heavy mahogany bedroom doors. Marcus growled in deep, immediate irritation, slowly standing up to his full, wildly intimidating height. Enter, he commanded sharply, his demeanor instantly shifting back to the cold, ruthless, and unapproachable Alpha King. An elderly man wearing a crisp white medical coat stepped cautiously into the room, holding a sterile silver tray with trembling hands. Forgive the sudden intrusion, Your Majesty, the royal doctor stammered nervously, his eyes firmly glued to the floorboards. The High Council urgently insists on a blood test to confirm the humans. I mean, the new Luna's viability for producing an heir. The clinical words viability and heir slammed into my chest like a physical, devastating, and deeply humiliating blow. I was exactly 52 years old. The biological possibility of bearing a child was a long-closed, deeply painful chapter of my life. I looked fearfully at Marcus, fully expecting to finally see the sudden, regretful realization of his massive, foolish mistake. Instead, I saw a horrific, uncontrollably murderous rage completely explode in his glowing golden eyes. He crossed the massive bedroom in a mere fraction of a second, violently grabbing the terrified doctor by the throat. My Luna is not an animal to be tested as breeding stock for the Council's political amusement, Marcus roared, lifting the man entirely off the floor. If any of you ever mention her age or her fertility again, I will personally burn the High Council building to the ground with all of you inside. The terrified doctor gasped desperately for air, his wrinkled face turning a dangerous, sickening shade of deep purple. I watched the sudden, violent display in absolute horror, realizing exactly what kind of ruthless monster was claiming to love me. Marcus, please stop. I screamed in pure panic, my voice cracking wildly as I aggressively pushed myself off the massive bed. You are going to kill him right in front of me for simply doing his job. My frantic, desperate voice miraculously cut through the thick, bloody fog of his primal, uncontrollable rage. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his massive chest heaving with violent, unsated aggression and adrenaline. He casually dropped the gasping doctor to the hardwood floor like a piece of discarded, entirely worthless trash. "Get out of my sight right now before I completely change my mind," Marcus snarled darkly at the coughing, pathetic man. The doctor scrambled desperately out of the room on his hands and knees, leaving the heavy mahogany doors wide open in his panicked wake. Marcus slowly turned back to me, the lethal, terrifying violence in his eyes slowly softening as he looked at my pale, terrified face. He walked slowly toward me, his heavy combat boots making absolutely no sound on the thick, expensive rugs. I instinctively took a step back, my spine hitting the cold, hardwood of the bedpost directly behind me. "Do not ever fear me, Grace," he whispered pleadingly, stopping just inches away from my trembling, trapped body. "I will never direct my anger or my violence toward you, not in 1,000 different lifetimes." But the terrifying reality of my new situation had finally, completely settled deep into my exhausted bones. He might never physically strike me, but he would absolutely destroy the entire world to keep me locked inside this room. The High Council had inadvertently reminded me of the glaring, biological truth of my very human age. I was an aging human woman trapped in a dangerous, magical political game I did not understand or want to play. "They will never, ever accept me here," I whispered brokenly, staring up at his handsome, terrifyingly perfect face. "Your ancient people want a young, powerful wolf to give you strong heirs, not an old human widow whose life is already half over." Marcus reached out, grabbing the back of my neck with a sudden, fierce possessiveness that made me gasp out loud. He gently but firmly forced me to look directly into his blazing eyes, completely ignoring my quiet, desperate tears. "I do not care about heirs, I do not care about the council, and I do not care about their pathetic ancient traditions. I only care about the beating of your heart, the fire in your soul, and the scent of your skin against mine." He leaned down, pressing his warm forehead aggressively and intimately against my own. "Tomorrow at noon, I am going to publicly crown you as the absolute, unquestioned ruler of this entire kingdom. And anyone who dares to object to my choice will simply cease to exist by nightfall." The blinding morning sun pierced ruthlessly through the heavy velvet curtains of my golden prison. I had not slept a single, peaceful second during the long, terrifying night. Marcus had held me firmly against his burning chest until the very moment dawn broke over the mountains. He only left the massive bed when a frantic royal general banged on the door with a critical military emergency. Now, I sat completely alone in the center of the impossibly soft, ruined silk mattress. I slowly lifted my trembling hands, staring intensely at the faint age spots and raised blue veins on my skin. They were the quiet, undeniable proof of a long, exhausting human life lived entirely in the shadows. Suddenly, a strange, burning sensation pulsed sharply from the jagged bite mark on the side of my neck. It was not just physical pain anymore, it was a bizarre, overwhelming flood of foreign emotions. I could actually feel Marcus's distant, simmering rage and his frantic anxiety echoing directly inside my own mind. The supernatural mate bond was terrifyingly real, actively rewriting my basic human biology with every passing hour. Before I could process this horrifying realization, the heavy mahogany bedroom doors swung open without a single knock. A stunningly beautiful woman stepped into the private sanctuary, her high heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She looked absolutely flawless, possessing the glowing, unblemished skin of a healthy 20-year-old girl. But the cold, ancient cruelty in her freezing blue eyes revealed she had walked this earth for centuries. "So, this is the tragic, decaying creature our great Alpha King is willing to burn his kingdom down for," she sneered. She walked slowly toward the bed, looking at me with a mixture of profound disgust and absolute, arrogant pity. "I am High Elder Serafina, and I have come to fix the catastrophic mistake our king made last night." I pulled the silk sheet tightly up to my chin, acutely aware of my messy graying hair and my tired, lined face. Next to her immortal, glowing perfection, I felt exactly like a discarded, withering autumn leaf. "You do not need to insult me," I said quietly, my voice raspy and entirely drained of emotional energy. "I already know I do not belong in this magnificent, terrifying place with your immortal ruler." Serafina laughed mockingly, a harsh, musical sound that completely lacked any genuine human warmth or empathy. "At least you have the basic common sense to recognize your own pathetic, biological expiration date, human." She stopped at the edge of the bed, crossing her perfectly sculpted arms over her expensive designer dress. "The High Council will never allow a barren, 52-year-old mortal widow to sit on the ancient royal throne. If you actually step onto that coronation balcony at noon, a designated sniper will put a silver bullet through your fragile skull." My heart stopped completely in my chest, a cold wave of pure, absolute terror washing over my entire body. I had spent my entire life avoiding danger, and now I was the primary target of a supernatural political assassination. "I don't want the crown, and I certainly don't want to die for a man I barely even know," I whispered desperately. Serafina smiled coldly, reaching into the pocket of her elegant dress and pulling out a small, dark glass vial. "Swallow this potion. It will temporarily completely erase the king's identifying scent and bite mark from your aging blood. I have a secret carriage waiting by the servants' gate to take you far past the kingdom's heavily guarded borders. You will simply disappear back into the miserable, obscure poverty you came from, and Marcus will eventually forget you." I stared at the small glass vial, my trembling hand instinctively reaching out to accept my only chance at survival. It was a deeply humiliating retreat, but I preferred quiet humiliation over a violent, bloody death in a foreign court. My trembling fingers were merely an inch away from the cold glass when the heavy bedroom doors violently exploded inward. The solid mahogany wood splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, flying dangerously across the massive room. Marcus stood in the ruined doorway, breathing heavily, looking exactly like a pure, unchained demon of destruction. The terrifying, murderous aura radiating from his massive body made the heavy crystal chandelier above us rattle violently. Serafina spun around, her flawless, immortal face instantly draining of all its arrogant, mocking color. "Your Majesty, I was merely explaining the traditional protocols to the new guest," she stammered, frantically hiding the vial. Marcus crossed the large room faster than my human eyes could possibly track or comprehend. He aggressively grabbed the High Elder by her long, beautiful blonde hair, yanking her violently backward to the floor. She screamed in pure agony, a sound that deeply chilled the blood running through my terrified veins. "You dared to enter my private sanctum to threaten my fated Luna with cheap, cowardly poison?" Marcus roared. His voice was not human, it was the dark, resonant command of a monstrous beast demanding immediate, bloody retribution. "Marcus, stop!" I cried out, terrified that I was about to witness a brutal murder right at the foot of my bed. He ignored my desperate plea entirely, easily prying the dark glass vial from Serafina's desperately clenched fist. "You think her age makes her weak, Serafina," he snarled, his glowing golden eyes burning with unspeakable violence. "Her soul possesses more genuine power and grace in a single second than you have gathered in 3 pathetic centuries." With a terrifying, sickening crunch, Marcus crushed the glass vial directly inside his bare, muscular hand. Dark liquid and sharp glass shards mixed with his own blood, dripping slowly onto the pristine white rug. "Guards," his massive voice boomed, summoning heavily armed soldiers who instantly flooded into the ruined room. "Take this miserable traitor to the underground dungeons and strip away every single piece of her noble rank. She will witness the noon coronation from a cold iron cage before I personally decide her ultimate execution date." The guards aggressively dragged the screaming, sobbing immortal woman out of the room without a moment of hesitation. The heavy silence that followed was completely suffocating, broken only by the sound of Marcus's heavy, ragged breathing. He slowly turned back to me, the violent, monstrous rage in his eyes instantly melting into desperate, possessive panic. He practically collapsed onto his knees beside the bed, aggressively pulling me by the waist into his blooded chest. "Did she hurt you, Grace?" he demanded frantically, his large hands rapidly checking my arms and face for injuries. "I am so incredibly sorry I left you alone. I will never let you out of my direct line of sight ever again." I sat frozen against his warm body, trembling uncontrollably as the dark reality of my situation finally settled in completely. "She was right, Marcus," I sobbed quietly, the bitter, humiliating tears finally spilling down my wrinkled cheeks. "They are going to assassinate me the moment I step onto that balcony, because I am too old and too human." Marcus pulled back slightly, gripping my face firmly with both of his blood-stained hands, forcing me to look at him. "There is no army on this earth, human or immortal, that can take you away from me now," he vowed darkly. "I am going to dress you in the finest silk, I am going to place my mother's ancient crown on your silver hair. And I am going to make this entire terrifying world bow down to the beautiful, perfect woman who owns my soul." A dozen terrified royal maids suddenly entered the room, carrying a breathtaking, custom-made gown of midnight blue velvet. The overwhelming, undeniable momentum of the king's obsessive will was violently dragging me toward the throne. There was no more running, no more hiding, and absolutely no way to escape the deadly, royal spotlight. The royal maids moved with terrifying, silent efficiency to strip away my ruined, cheap civilian clothes. They bathed my trembling body in incredibly warm water that smelled heavily of rare orchids and dark sandalwood. I stared blankly into the massive, gilded vanity mirror as they carefully brushed my silver-streaked hair. They did not try to dye my fading hair or hide the deep, natural lines etched around my tired eyes. Marcus had given them explicit, terrifying orders to leave my natural, aging face entirely untouched by makeup. He wanted the entire immortal world to see exactly who he had chosen to rule beside him. The midnight blue velvet gown was incredibly heavy, woven with microscopic threads of pure, shimmering silver. It hugged the soft, mature curves of my body in a way that made me feel dangerously exposed to the world. A massive, breathtaking diamond necklace was fastened securely around my throat, perfectly hiding the angry bite mark. The silk of my expensive dress felt exactly like a heavy battle armor I was never trained to wear. When Marcus finally re-entered the dressing room, the entire royal staff instantly dropped to their knees in fear. He was dressed in full, terrifying ceremonial armor forged from impenetrable, magically enhanced black steel. He looked exactly like a legendary, bloodthirsty god of war preparing to absolutely annihilate his mortal enemies. But his glowing golden eyes softened into absolute, liquid devotion the very second he looked at me. "You are the most breathtakingly beautiful creature this ancient world has ever seen," he whispered hoarsely. I lowered my gaze quickly, still deeply fighting the lifelong conditioning that told me I was entirely worthless. "They are going to kill us the moment we step outside, Marcus," I reminded him, my voice trembling with raw fear. He stepped forward, gently lifting my chin with his heavily armored, physically indestructible black gauntlet. "I would gladly let this entire kingdom burn to ash before I let a single bullet touch your beautiful skin." He offered me his strong arm, and I took it because my trembling legs could no longer support my own weight. We walked slowly through the massive, echoing stone corridors of the ancient, terrifying royal palace. Hundreds of elite, heavily armed royal guards formed a tight, impenetrable wall of steel directly around us. The deafening roar of the massive crowd outside grew louder and more terrifying with every single step we took. Over 100,000 supernatural citizens had gathered in the massive square directly below the royal balcony. My breathing was shallow, completely restricted by the tight bodice of the incredibly expensive velvet gown. My heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against my bruised ribs, making it incredibly hard to think. The massive brass doors leading to the grand stone balcony slowly groaned open, revealing the blinding midday sun. A suffocating, heavy wave of chaotic sound immediately crashed over me like a violent, freezing ocean wave. Marcus pulled me firmly against his armored side, his sheer physical heat powerfully grounding my spiraling panic. We stepped out onto the sunlit marble balcony, and the massive crowd instantly fell into a shocked, dead silence. Every single supernatural eye was suddenly locked intently onto the fragile, aging human woman standing beside their immortal king. I could physically feel their intense confusion, their rising anger, and their bitter, ancient prejudice washing over me. A 52-year-old human widow was an absolute, unforgivable insult to their proud, predatory, immortal bloodlines. I could feel the intensely hostile glares of the High Council members standing on the adjacent VIP balconies. They hated my deep wrinkles, they hated my fragile humanity, and they utterly despised my undeniable hold over their king. Marcus slowly raised his armored hand, and the heavy, terrifying silence stretched to an unbearable, breaking point. Behold your new Luna, the absolute ruler of my heart and the undisputed queen of this realm, his massive voice boomed. His dark, unnatural voice was magically amplified, echoing violently off the distant, snow-capped mountain peaks. Before a single citizen could cheer or scream in protest, my newly formed supernatural mate Bond violently screamed a deadly warning. A blinding flash of silver light suddenly erupted from a high, dark clock tower directly across the massive square. The sharp, terrifying crack of a high-powered sniper rifle violently shattered the tense, fragile silence of the city. Serafina's deadly threat was not a cheap bluff. The High Council had actually ordered my immediate, public execution. The lethal sniper's bullet was specifically meant to shatter my skull and forcefully end the king's foolish human obsession. I did not even have the necessary time to scream, run, or close my terrified eyes against the incoming death. Marcus moved faster than light itself, spinning violently and completely shielding my fragile body with his own massive frame. A sickening, loud metallic thud echoed sharply as the heavy silver bullet slammed directly into his broad back. The massive crowd erupted into absolute, chaotic pandemonium as the immortal king staggered slightly forward against the marble railing. Marcus! I screamed in pure, unadulterated terror, aggressively grabbing his massive armored shoulders with my shaking hands. Silver was the only known substance on this earth that could actually kill an immortal, ancient alpha wolf. He slowly turned back to me, breathing heavily, but a dark, terrifying, and extremely arrogant smile was playing on his lips. He casually reached behind his back, easily pulling the crushed, smoking silver bullet right out of his thick black armor. The deadly projectile had not even pierced his skin. His raw, ancient magical power was simply far too strong for standard weapons. Instead of dying, the assassination attempt only proved the terrifying, undeniable depths of his violent, absolute devotion to me. He crushed the smoking silver bullet into fine dust, dropping it casually over the edge of the high royal balcony. Is that the absolute best the High Council can do? Marcus roared, his furious voice shaking the very stone foundations of the city. He suddenly reached out with terrifying speed, grabbing a terrified, fleeing council member from the balcony directly below ours. He hoisted the screaming, thrashing nobleman up by the neck, dangling him effortlessly over the deadly, terrifying drop. I explicitly warned you all what would happen if anyone dared to threaten my fated mate, Marcus snarled darkly. He casually opened his hand and dropped the screaming council member, letting him fall violently into the chaotic, terrified crowd below. The blood of his political enemies would absolutely flow through the city streets before he ever let me go. Grace is your queen, and her mere breath is worth more than every single immortal life in this miserable city. He turned his massive body back to me, gently wiping a stray, terrified tear from my pale cheek with his armored thumb. In front of 100,000 absolutely terrified, screaming subjects, the Alpha King slowly dropped to one armored knee. The raw power radiating from his kneeling form sent a terrifying, yet strangely intoxicating thrill straight down my spine. He carefully pulled the ancient, priceless diamond crown from a velvet pillow held by a trembling, sobbing servant. He gently and deliberately placed the heavy, beautiful crown directly onto my messy, silver-streaked hair. Long live the Luna, Marcus declared passionately, softly kissing the back of my wrinkled, trembling, human hand. The massive crowd, entirely broken by his terrifying display of absolute power and ruthless violence, instantly fell to their knees. A deafening, perfectly synchronized chant of absolute submission roared through the massive stone square. I looked down at the endless sea of bowing, incredibly powerful immortals, realizing my quiet, human life was officially, permanently dead. I was no longer a forgotten, aging widow hiding desperately in the dark, lonely shadows of a cruel human world. I was the terrifyingly powerful Alpha King's ultimate weakness, and I was exactly where I was always meant to be. The heavy oak doors of the royal chambers slammed shut, instantly cutting off the deafening roar of the massive crowd outside. I stood completely frozen in the center of the vast room, the heavy diamond crown pressing down on my silver hair like a physical burden. My lungs desperately struggled to draw in enough oxygen beneath the tight, restrictive bodice of my midnight blue velvet gown. I had just witnessed a brutal, cold-blooded murder committed by the very man who was now gently locking the bedroom door. Marcus slowly turned to face me, the terrifying, bloodthirsty aura of the Alpha King instantly melting away into deep exhaustion. He looked incredibly heavy, as if the ancient, magical black steel armor he wore was suddenly weighing down his immortal soul. Without saying a single word, he began to unfasten the intricate leather straps and heavy metal plates of his battle gear. The heavy breastplate hit the thick Persian rug with a dull, heavy thud, revealing his sweat-drenched, finely tailored white shirt. My eyes immediately locked onto the massive, terrifyingly dark purple bruise spreading rapidly across his muscular left shoulder. The silver sniper bullet had not broken his impenetrable skin, but the sheer kinetic impact had still caused massive internal damage. He had deliberately absorbed the devastating, bone-shattering force of the assassination attempt just to keep me entirely safe. A sudden, overwhelming wave of profound guilt and treacherous affection violently crashed over my fragile, terrified heart. I slowly took a step toward him, the heavy velvet skirts of my dress brushing softly against the pristine hardwood floor. "You are actually hurt, Marcus," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly small and fragile in the massive, silent expanse of the bedroom. He paused, looking up at me with glowing golden eyes that were entirely devoid of the monstrous violence I had seen on the balcony. "It is absolutely nothing, my sweet Grace," he murmured smoothly, casually dismissing the horrific injury as if it were a mere scratch. "I would gladly let them break every single bone in my immortal body if it meant keeping your beautiful smile completely safe." I reached out with trembling hands, my rough, wrinkled fingers gently hovering over the massive, darkened bruise on his skin. The searing heat radiating from his massive body seeped directly through his ruined shirt, instantly warming my permanently cold hands. "You dropped a man to his violent death today, Marcus," I said quietly, the horrific reality of the execution still echoing loudly in my mind. "I am just a simple human woman who bakes pies and reads old paperback novels in a quiet, lonely suburban kitchen. I do not know how to be the ruthless queen of a violent, immortal world built entirely on blood, magic, and ancient dominance." Marcus gently caught my trembling hand, bringing my scarred, aging knuckles up to his incredibly soft, warm lips. "You do not need to be ruthless, Grace, you only need to be exactly who you already are," he replied with absolute, unwavering certainty. "Your profound compassion and your gentle, human heart are the exact things this dark, decaying kingdom desperately needs to survive." He gently pulled me closer, his massive hands carefully reaching up to remove the heavy, priceless diamond crown from my head. He set the ancient symbol of absolute power onto a side table, completely indifferent to its unimaginable monetary and historical value. His rough thumbs gently massaged my aching temples, instantly relieving the sharp headache the heavy jewelry had caused. "I am incredibly terrified of the future, Marcus," I finally confessed, the heavy, emotional walls around my isolated heart completely crumbling. "I am 52 years old, and my human body is already beginning the slow, inevitable, an entirely natural process of fading away. You are an immortal, ageless Alpha King who will look exactly this terrifyingly handsome for the next 1,000 years. One day, very soon, I will grow truly frail, my human memory will fade, and I will die, leaving you completely alone in the dark. The profound, agonizing truth of my biological reality hung heavily in the quiet air between us, absolutely impossible to ignore. But Marcus did not pull away, nor did he look at me with the pity or regret I so desperately expected to see in his eyes. Instead, a fierce, burning possessiveness violently ignited in his golden gaze, completely stealing the breath right out of my lungs. You are completely mistaken about the sacred, ancient nature of the true mate bond, my beautiful Grace, he growled softly. He pulled me flush against his hard, muscular chest, allowing me to feel the frantic, powerful, and desperate beating of his heart. When I sank my teeth into your delicate neck last night, I did not just forcefully claim your physical body. I permanently tied my ancient, immortal soul directly to your fragile, beautiful, and deeply resilient human spirit. My supernatural vitality, my absolute strength, and my endless lifespan are now flowing directly into your human veins. He gently tilted my chin up, forcing me to look directly into the overwhelming, terrifying depths of his eternal devotion. You are not going to wither away, you are not going to grow frail, and you are absolutely never going to die alone. Your silver hair and your beautiful laugh lines will permanently remain, because I absolutely adore every single mark of your survival. But your human heart will beat for centuries alongside mine, and we will watch the human empires crumble into dust together. His impossible, world-shattering words completely paralyzed my rational mind, permanently destroying every single fear I had left. I had spent my entire life desperately trying to shrink myself down, to take up absolutely no space in a cruel, dismissive world. But this terrifying, bloodthirsty king wanted to expand my brief, quiet existence into a massive, eternal, and magnificent empire. The overwhelming, undeniable weight of his absolute love finally shattered the last remaining barriers protecting my lonely heart. I let out a soft, broken sob, violently throwing my arms around his broad, unyielding shoulders, burying my face in his warm neck. I breathed in the deep, intoxicating scent of dark pine, cold rain, and the metallic tang of his dried blood. Marcus let out a deep, shuddering sigh of profound relief, his strong arms wrapping entirely around my trembling, yielding body. He buried his handsome face into my silver-streaked hair, holding me tightly as if I were the only precious thing keeping him alive. I am completely yours, Marcus, I whispered into his skin, finally surrendering to the terrifying, beautiful destiny I had tried to outrun. I will stay by your side, I will wear your heavy crown, and I will love you fearlessly until the very end of time itself. His massive body trembled at my quiet confession, the ruthless Alpha King entirely brought to his knees by a simple human promise. He slowly pulled back, his glowing golden eyes burning with a dark, primal hunger that made my blood run incredibly hot. He carefully unzipped the back of my heavy velvet gown, letting the incredibly expensive fabric pool uselessly at our feet. I stood before him entirely exposed, carrying the undeniable physical evidence of a long life lived completely without him. But his reverent, burning gaze worshipped every single stretch mark, every faint scar, and every soft curve of my aging body. He gently picked me up, carrying me toward the massive canopy bed with the absolute reverence of a priest approaching a sacred altar. The terrifying, violent events of the day completely faded away, entirely replaced by the overwhelming, consuming fire of his absolute passion. There was absolutely no more running, no more hiding, and no more pretending that I was an invisible, unwanted widow. I was the eternal, fated Luna of the Alpha King, and I was finally, entirely, and miraculously home. The golden morning sunlight spilled softly across the massive, ruined expanse of our beautiful royal canopy bed. I woke up slowly, breathing in the deep, intoxicating scent of dark pine and rain that now permanently belonged to me. For the absolute first time in over 20 long years, The deep, chronic ache in my aging joints was completely and miraculously gone. I lifted my hand in the quiet light, marveling silently at the faint blue veins and soft wrinkles that still decorated my pale skin. I was still undeniably a 52-year-old human woman, but a vibrant, impossible river of immortal energy was actively rushing through my human veins. Marcus lay sleeping heavily beside me, his massive, muscular arm wrapped fiercely and possessively across my bare, vulnerable waist. In the quiet, peaceful light of dawn, the terrifying, bloodthirsty Alpha King finally looked vulnerable, exhausted, and entirely at peace. I gently brushed a stray lock of dark hair from his forehead, my fragile heart overflowing with an overwhelming, terrifying tide of absolute love. Suddenly, a piercing, horrific siren violently shattered the quiet serenity of our secure royal bedchamber. The deafening, mechanical scream of the palace alarm system signaled a catastrophic, immediate breach of the heavily guarded inner perimeter. Marcus woke instantly, his glowing golden eyes snapping open with a lethal, predatory sharpness that completely lacked any human confusion. He was entirely out of the massive bed in a mere fraction of a second, moving with a terrifying, violent grace that blurred my human vision. "Do not move from this bed, Grace," he commanded sharply, his deep voice immediately dropping into a dark, guttural growl of pure, terrifying war. He hastily pulled on his dark trousers and strapped a massive, terrifyingly sharp silver broadsword directly to his broad, heavily scarred back. Serafina's desperate loyalists in the High Council have completely breached the southern gates, and they are bringing the fighting directly into the palace. He pressed a hard, desperate kiss to my forehead, his massive hands trembling slightly with pure, uncontrollable adrenaline and absolute protective rage. "I have to lock you inside the underground, reinforced panic room until I have personally slaughtered every single traitor in this entire building." He turned to leave the room, fully expecting my immediate, terrified compliance, exactly like the frightened, invisible widow I had been yesterday. But a sudden, fierce, and entirely unfamiliar fire violently roared to life deep inside my beating, resilient human heart. I was no longer just a fragile, aging civilian desperately hiding from the violent, unpredictable storms of an unfair, cruel world. I was the fully bonded, immortal Luna of the most dangerous, powerful apex predator currently walking the face of the earth. "I am not hiding in the dark ever again, Marcus," I stated clearly, my voice ringing with an absolute, shocking authority that deeply surprised even me. He froze entirely in the ruined doorway, slowly turning his massive, scarred body to stare at me in absolute, profound disbelief. I threw off the heavy silk sheets and confidently stepped onto the cold hardwood floor, standing as tall as my fragile human frame would possibly allow. I picked up his heavy, blood-stained military coat from the floor and wrapped it tightly around my bare, trembling shoulders. The heavy, dark wool smelled exactly like a terrifying battlefield, but it also smelled like the absolute, uncompromising protection of my fated mate. "You explicitly told me last night that my soul possesses more genuine power than any immortal sitting on that miserable, arrogant council," I reminded him fiercely. "If I run and hide now like a frightened, aging mouse, I will absolutely prove to them that I am completely unworthy of your heavy diamond crown." Marcus stared at my determined, wrinkled face, his glowing golden eyes slowly widening with a complex mixture of absolute terror and profound, terrifying pride. "They are heavily armed, immortal, bloodthirsty killers who desperately want to mount your beautiful head on a silver spike, Grace," he warned darkly. "Then they will have to look their new queen directly in the eyes before they try to take it," I replied coldly, walking steadily toward the heavy wooden door. The massive stone corridors of the royal palace were already echoing with the terrifying, bloody sounds of immediate, desperate, and brutal combat. The sharp, deafening clash of silver steel, the desperate screams of dying men, and the horrific, guttural snarls of shifting wolves echoed violently. Marcus stepped immediately in front of me, willingly using his massive, indestructible body as a living, breathing shield against the incoming chaos. We turned the corner into the grand eastern hallway, immediately coming face to face with a massive, heavily armed rebel death squad. A towering, heavily scarred wolf covered in fresh blood stepped forward, holding a dripping, lethal silver blade in his massive, trembling hand. "Hand over the miserable, aging human abomination, Your Majesty, and the High Council will mercifully spare your immortal life," the rebel leader sneered loudly. He looked directly at me with absolute, undisguised revulsion, completely blinded by his own immortal, arrogant prejudice against my human fragility and age. Marcus let out a terrifying, world-shattering roar, reaching for his heavy broadsword with a dark, murderous intent that instantly chilled the surrounding air. "No, Marcus," I said softly, gently placing my small, wrinkled hand directly onto his tense, violently trembling, extremely muscular forearm. He stopped instantly, his terrifying, highly destructive momentum entirely halted by the simple, gentle, and loving pressure of my human touch. I stepped slowly around his massive, protective frame, directly facing the terrifying, blood-soaked immortal killers standing aggressively in our hallway. Every single survival instinct I had carefully learned in my 52 years of life screamed at me to run, to hide, and to desperately beg for mercy. But the ancient, supernatural mate bond humming powerfully in my veins actively fed me a cold, terrifying, and absolute regal calm. I looked directly into the furious, glowing eyes of the massive rebel leader, absolutely refusing to break eye contact or show a single ounce of fear. "You claim to be superior, immortal beings of ancient, magical power and unyielding, absolute physical strength," I said, my voice echoing clearly down the bloody hall. "Yet you are so completely terrified of a 52-year-old human widow that you had to burn your own magnificent home to the ground just to reach me." The rebel leader sneered viciously, raising his heavy silver sword to strike, but I did not take a single, cowardly step backward. I have survived profound, crushing grief, decades of bitter, invisible loneliness, and the slow, inevitable, deeply painful decay of my own physical body. I have successfully fought silent, exhausting battles in the dark that your pampered, arrogant immortal souls could not possibly begin to comprehend. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, the heavy, suffocating alpha aura of my mate completely wrapping around my words like a terrifying, physical weapon. "I am the undisputed, fated lunar of this entire kingdom, and I absolutely command you to drop your pathetic weapons and immediately drop to your knees." The sheer, impossible audacity of my absolute, unwavering command completely shocked the massive, heavily armed rebel death squad into a dead, terrified silence. The heavy, terrifying weight of the Alpha King's raw, ancient magic suddenly surged violently through our bond, massively amplifying my quiet human authority. It was a physical, crushing, and absolute pressure that slammed directly into the arrogant, treacherous wolves, violently forcing the very air out of their immortal lungs. The massive rebel leader gasped loudly, his thick legs violently buckling under the terrifying, combined magical and psychological weight of our united souls. His heavy, lethal silver sword slipped completely from his trembling, weakened hands, clattering loudly and pathetically against the cold marble floor. One by one, the elite, bloodthirsty rebel soldiers collapsed onto the ground, absolutely paralyzed by the overwhelming, combined presence of their true king and queen. I had not fired a single silver bullet, nor had I swung a single heavy sword, but I had completely broken their violent, treacherous rebellion with pure, unyielding spirit. Marcus stepped slowly up behind me, wrapping his massive, incredibly warm arms securely around my waist, deeply burying his face in my silver hair. "I absolutely told you so, Grace," he whispered, his deep, rumbling voice thick with absolute awe, terrifying devotion, and profound, unshakable pride. "You are the most powerful, magnificently terrifying creature this ancient world has ever seen, and they will all quickly learn to worship the ground you walk on." The heavily armed royal guards flooded the hallway a few moments later, easily securing the terrified, completely broken rebels who were still kneeling pathetically on the floor. I leaned entirely back against my powerful, immortal king, my human heart beating wildly, completely ready to ruthlessly rule the terrifying, beautiful empire he had laid at my feet. The heavy, iron-reinforced doors of the ancient throne room swung open with a deafening, echoing finality. I walked slowly beside my formidable Alpha King, our fingers tightly intertwined in a silent, unbreakable vow of absolute unity. The air inside the colossal marble hall was thick with the sharp scent of fear, copper blood, and total, crushing defeat. Dozens of surviving elite rebel soldiers and disgraced council members were kneeling bound on the cold, unforgiving stone floor. They kept their heads bowed in absolute terror, utterly paralyzed by the overwhelming, dark aura radiating from Marcus. Right in the center of the vast room, a heavy iron cage suspended by thick steel chains held the true mastermind of the treason. High Elder Serafina gripped the cold iron bars, her knuckles completely white and her flawless dress torn and stained with dirt. Yesterday, her glowing, immortal youth and her cruel, mocking words had made me feel completely worthless and entirely invisible. She had successfully weaponized my deep insecurities about my fading beauty and my 52 years of human survival. Today, looking at her pathetic, caged, and entirely broken form, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. I did not walk toward the shadows like the frightened, aging widow who had first entered this terrifying palace. I walked purposefully toward the grand, elevated obsidian throne, fully wearing Marcus's heavy, blood-stained military coat over my shoulders. Marcus did not sit on the king's chair. Instead, he gently guided me to sit directly upon the massive, ancient seat of ultimate power. He stood tall and incredibly imposing right beside me, resting his hand on the hilt of his broadsword, acting as my personal, indestructible shield. "You have failed miserably, Serafina," Marcus declared, his dark, rumbling voice vibrating ominously through the cavernous throne room. "You brought war into my sacred home, you threatened the life of my fated Luna, and you fractured the peace of our entire kingdom." Serafina let out a harsh, desperate laugh that sounded entirely devoid of her usual musical, arrogant perfection. She pressed her beautiful, dirt-streaked face against the iron bars, her freezing blue eyes locking onto me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You can kill me today, Your Majesty, but the fundamental, biological truth will remain exactly the same for all eternity. She is just a fragile, decaying human woman who will inevitably wither, wrinkle, and die while you remain a magnificent, immortal god." My rebellion was an act of profound loyalty to our proud heritage, to save our ancient bloodline from the humiliating taint of human mortality. A dangerous, lethal snarl instantly ripped through Marcus's broad chest, and he took a sudden, violent step toward the suspended iron cage. He was entirely prepared to rip the iron bars apart with his bare hands and tear out her treacherous heart in front of the entire royal court. "Wait, Marcus," I commanded softly, raising my right hand with a calm, unhurried grace that immediately halted the Alpha King in his tracks. The entire hall held its collective breath, absolutely terrified and captivated by the simple human woman who could leash a monster with a whisper. I slowly stood up from the dark obsidian throne, my silver-streaked hair catching the bright morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. I walked down the marble steps, stopping just a few feet away from the heavy iron cage holding the immortal, beautiful traitor. "You are entirely obsessed with the superficial illusion of youth and the stagnant, unchanging nature of your endless supernatural lifespan," I told her quietly. "You look at my wrinkles, my fading hair, and my physical scars, and you mistakenly see them as undeniable proof of fundamental weakness. But you have never actually lived, Serafina. You have merely existed in a sterile, golden bubble, completely terrified of change and consequence." I looked deeply into her cold blue eyes, actively channeling the overwhelming, ancient magic of the mate bond to amplify my quiet human voice. Every single line on my face is a hard-won battle scar from surviving a deeply imperfect, painful, and beautiful human life. I have known profound heartbreak, I have survived the bitter loss of loved ones, and I have learned to rebuild my soul from absolute ashes. That agonizing, beautiful human journey gave me a resilient, unbreakable core that your pampered, immortal vanity could never possibly break. Serafina flinched violently, stepping backward into the center of her cold iron cage as if my quiet, truthful words had physically struck her face. For the absolute first time in her centuries of privileged existence, the ancient High Elder looked genuinely, profoundly terrified. "What is your royal decree, my queen?" Marcus asked respectfully, his golden eyes burning with intense, overwhelming adoration as he watched me rule. "Shall I execute every single traitor in this room and mount their arrogant heads on the outer palace walls as a permanent warning?" I looked around the room at the trembling, defeated immortals who had arrogantly believed they were entirely superior to my human existence. Death was far too quick, far too merciful, and incredibly meaningless for creatures who had never valued the precious, fragile nature of life. "No, Marcus," I replied, my voice echoing clearly and firmly across the silent, captivated throne room. "We are not going to spill any more blood today, because a true queen does not build her foundation on mindless, brutal slaughter. They despise the natural, painful process of human aging and the fragile, fleeting nature of mortality above absolutely all else." I turned back to Serafina, my eyes cold and entirely devoid of the merciful hesitation that had defined my previous, invisible life. "Therefore, my official judgment is that the High Council traitors will be entirely stripped of their inner wolves and their ancient magic." A collective gasp of sheer, unadulterated horror violently rippled through the kneeling prisoners and the heavily guarded royal spectators. "You cannot possibly do that!" Serafina screamed in absolute panic, aggressively shaking the iron bars of her cage with desperate, bruising force. "To sever an immortal from their wolf is an agonizing fate far worse than death itself. You will turn us into pathetic, ordinary humans." "Exactly," I said calmly, completely unmoved by her sudden, frantic, and entirely hypocritical tears. "You will be permanently banished to the human world, where you will slowly age, you will fall ill, and you will eventually face the terrifying unknown of death. You will finally learn the true, agonizing value of a single, fragile year, and you will learn to survive without your arrogant, magical privilege." Marcus let out a low, dark chuckle of profound, undeniable approval, the terrifying sound sending fresh shivers of fear down the spines of the traitors. He stepped forward, raising his large, scarred hand, and instantly unleashed a blinding, crushing wave of ancient, absolute alpha dominance. I watched in awe as the invisible, magical ties binding the traitors to their immortal strength were violently, permanently shattered by his royal command. Serafina collapsed onto the floor of her iron cage, screaming in profound, biological agony as the dark magic actively left her perfect body. Within moments, the terrifying, elite supernatural rebels were reduced to nothing more than ordinary, weeping, and deeply vulnerable mortals. I had effectively destroyed my greatest political enemies without lifting a single blade, entirely using the very humanity they had so deeply despised. The surviving, loyal members of the royal court immediately dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads firmly against the cold marble floor. They were no longer bowing solely out of sheer terror of the Alpha King's violent retribution and legendary, bloody temper. They were bowing in genuine, absolute reverence to a 52-year-old human queen who possessed a soul far more terrifying and magnificent than magic itself. Marcus wrapped his warm, heavily muscled arm securely around my waist, pulling me firmly against his side in front of the entire kneeling kingdom. "You are a terrifyingly brilliant, incredibly dangerous masterpiece, Grace," he whispered warmly against the sensitive shell of my ear. "And I am going to spend the rest of eternity thanking the stars that you accidentally stumbled into my dark, lonely gardens." The warm, golden sunlight of late spring spilled gently across the sprawling, immaculate royal gardens. I sat peacefully on a beautifully carved stone bench, surrounded by thousands of blooming, fragrant white roses. I was no longer wearing the heavy, restrictive velvet gowns or the terrifyingly heavy diamond crown of my coronation day. Instead, I wore a simple, elegant flowing white dress that caught the soft, warm afternoon breeze. 6 months had passed since the violent, bloody rebellion that had violently threatened to tear this ancient kingdom apart. The terrified, arrogant immortal world had slowly learned to deeply respect, and even genuinely love, their human queen. I did not rule them with the cold, ruthless iron fist of traditional alpha dominance or ancient magical terror. I ruled them with the quiet, profound empathy and deep understanding I had learned from decades of human suffering. I reached up, gently tucking a loose strand of my silver-streaked hair behind my ear, smiling softly at the peaceful silence. I had completely stopped trying to hide my age, my wrinkles, or the visible, undeniable physical history of my long life. The supernatural mate bond humming in my veins had completely erased the chronic, aching pain in my aging human joints. It had infused my fragile, older body with an impossible, vibrant river of endless, glowing immortal energy. I would never grow frail, I would never succumb to disease, and I would absolutely never fade away into the dark again. Marcus had miraculously frozen my biological clock exactly at 52 years old, preserving the very version of me he fell in love with. I heard the familiar, heavy, deliberate crunch of thick combat boots approaching slowly on the white gravel path. A sudden, treacherous thrill of pure, undeniable desire instantly shot straight down my spine, warming my entire body. Even after 6 months of waking up in his massive arms, his overwhelming physical presence still took my breath away. Marcus stepped out from beneath the shade of the ancient oak trees, looking absolutely devastating and terrifyingly handsome. He was dressed in a simple dark shirt and tailored trousers, completely free of his heavy, intimidating black battle armor. His glowing golden eyes instantly found me among the sea of white roses, completely ignoring everything else in the world. The dark, legendary Alpha King, widely feared across 3 continents, smiled softly, looking exactly like a man who had finally found heaven. He walked slowly toward me, his massive, heavily scarred hands holding a single, perfectly blooming wild purple orchid. I searched the entire southern mountain range just to find the exact shade that matches your beautiful eyes, he murmured warmly. He gently tucked the rare, exotic flower behind my ear, his rough, warm fingers deliberately lingering on the soft skin of my neck. He pressed a deeply reverent, burning kiss directly over the jagged, faded scar of his permanent claiming mark. A massive, involuntary shiver of pure, absolute bliss rippled completely through my rejuvenated, humming body. You did not have to leave the massive, important council meetings just to bring me a flower, Marcus, I teased him gently. There is absolutely nothing in this entire universe more important than making sure my Luna smiles at least once an hour, he replied seriously. He gracefully dropped down to sit on the stone bench beside me, pulling my smaller frame effortlessly onto his muscular lap. I rested my head comfortably against his broad, solid chest, listening to the steady, powerful, and incredibly reassuring rhythm of his heart. Do you ever deeply miss your quiet, lonely little house and your simple, invisible human life, Grace? He asked quietly, wrapping his arms around me. I looked out over the massive, breathtakingly beautiful royal estate that I now completely and permanently called my true home. I thought about the terrifying, freezing night I had desperately run from him in the dark, pouring rain, terrified of losing my freedom. I had been so incredibly frightened of being locked in a gilded cage, completely unaware that his love was actually the ultimate liberation. I only deeply regret that I had to live 52 long, difficult years without you by my side, I answered with absolute, undeniable honesty. Every single bitter tear, every lonely night, and every painful heartbreak I endured was simply the necessary path that led me directly to your arms. Marcus let out a deep, shuddering breath, burying his handsome face completely into the crook of my neck, inhaling my scent deeply. I will spend the next 1,000 years making sure you never experience a single moment of sorrow or loneliness ever again, he vowed darkly. His absolute, Unwavering devotion was a heavy, magnificent anchor that permanently grounded my previously adrift, invisible soul. I gently lifted my hand, tangling my fingers deeply into his thick, dark hair, actively pulling him up to look directly into my eyes. The intense, golden fire burning in his gaze was exactly the same consuming, terrifying obsession I had first seen in the winter garden. But it no longer terrified me, because I now completely understood that this magnificent, violent monster belonged entirely to me. We have an entire eternity together to prove that promise, my beautiful Alpha, I whispered softly against his warm lips. He kissed me deeply, with a desperate, overwhelming passion that actively promised a lifetime of infinite, unyielding worship and absolute protection. The sun slowly began to set over the distant, snow-capped mountains, casting a brilliant, warm golden glow over our peaceful garden. I was Grace, the once invisible widow who had accidentally captured the dangerous, immortal heart of the terrifying Alpha King. I had completely stopped running, because I had finally realized there was absolutely nowhere else in the universe I would ever want to be. I was exactly where I belonged, permanently wrapped in the arms of my true mate, ruling an empire of eternal, undeniable love.